call it bribery, greasing the palm, or corruption. A report says 55% of South African companies surveyed avoid certain countries because of the high risk of corruption. This is according to the annual survey called International Attitudes to Corruption, published by Control Risks, a global business risk consultancy. We are now joined in studio by Victor Kgomoeswana. He is the author of the book, Africa is Open to Business. Good to have you, Victor. Welcome to the studio again.
Good to see you again, Le.
Now, according to this report, another report out saying corruption risk discourages investors from venturing out despite all of these opportunities that we have. Talk to us about your take on it.
It's tragic that we still have the assumption, the overriding assumption, that doing business across the continent or in South Africa equates to corruption. Couldn't be further from the truth. Let me tell you what I think of surveys like this. They make for good conversation, but they are not addressing the problem.
Right.
The question is, what is the private sector willing to do to make sure that nobody in their name bribes to get a deal? Because if I get a deal today because I bribed someone, I get rewarded as a creative salesman, right? But if my competition wins and I lose, suddenly I cry foul. You can't have it both ways.
Yeah.
The continent is just like any other country. Let's get this right. Corruption is an equation. On the one side, you have the person corrupting. On the other, you have the one who's corrupted. It's a transaction.
Yeah.
So there's no way a survey can say, oh, we are staying off because we perceive 46% of government transactions to be corrupt. Who's corrupting the government officials? So I want to hear the private sector say, in our name, nobody will bribe. And if we are an engineering society or we are a marketing company and one of us does that, we will we'll ostracize them.
Yeah.
Let's see that kind of commitment. Then maybe we can talk. Otherwise, we're just going to be surveying people and they're going to be rehashing old stories, telling us how they are scared of corruption. Who's not?
I do understand what you're saying, and I think it's very, very important. But if we solely blame it on the private sector and say, let's just say I'm a startup business, I want to contract with government, and government is one of the biggest payers, and I want their business. But I've got a corrupt official who says, right, if you want my business, give me something.
Yeah,
what
sure.
can you give me?
I wouldn't say I'm blaming it on the private sector.
It's either I get it or the next person who is going to give them something will get it. So I know what you're saying. If all of the private sector remain neutral and don't involve in this, but really shouldn't the blame be put at the government officials that are saying, give me this?
No, because we are all playing the same game. What I mean is the tender goes out, Leah and I tender, you tender, and we are going out. Somebody, you are willing to get ahead of me by paying a bribe. Right. I'm saying business sector, private sector is undermining its power, Leah, and let me tell you that. The private sector is a lot more organized and could make a call against corruption. I'm not saying government officials should be let off the hook. I'm saying if nobody goes out fishing, there's no story. In other words, if I keep going to the same river, throwing in the bait into the river, I can't blame the fish for biting, can I? So the question here is, if private sector will say, we collectively agree that if I lose the bid, I'll lose it. I'll not try and influence. Absolutely. Then we'll see a different story. Maybe it's a little idealistic, but unfortunately we got where we are because of idealists. And I believe that unless we understand that the private sector has a lot more power, we are going to continue talking about this. So I'm not saying the private sector is to blame. I'm saying corruption is an equation. And if you remove the one side, there's no equation. Because it's a transaction, we should understand that it's not enough for private sector to keep on saying government officials are corrupt when their peers somewhere are doing the same thing, fueling the same business.
Yeah.
It's like blaming prostitutes for moral decay.
Yeah, when there is a customer.
When there are people who are buying
there is a customer. No, I hear what you're saying, but like we say, it takes two to play the game, and that's, I think, the point that we're trying to make. The report... And I know we don't like to talk about the report, but
let's talk about it.
Let's bring up some of the details that it says. It says that 61% of South African companies have already pulled out of a deal at least once due to the risk of corruption. I mean, that's a high figure.
It is a high figure, and I applaud anybody who pulled out of a deal because of corruption. But don't cripple yourself. Pull out of a deal and lobby your mates and saying, next time I'm not pulling out, let's organize, You see, running a business, Leon, is not just running your trade. It's about lobbying and advocacy. So business should accept that as corporate citizens, it's not enough to look at corruption happening and pull out. I commend whoever pulls out of a deal, but then the next step should be, hey, hang on a second, I pulled out of this deal. It's not going to happen the next time. And eventually it does. I mean, look at what happened with the VW scandal, right?
Yeah.
Somebody had to blow the whistle. So eventually we can assume that's how all car manufacturers are doing it, or we can say whoever is doing it must be made to bear the responsibility.
Absolutely.
So don't pull out and say, I've withdrawn. I applaud you for not being corrupt, but in the end, what happened if you had been offered an opportunity to bribe and there was a way of getting around? Would you not have taken it?
Yeah. The next question that I was going to ask you is, what is at risk for businesses in this corrupt environment? And I think you very well may have already started on that answer, because if we take the VW example, the brand has taken a massive hammering due to it.
And the share prices, imagine you've invested in VW all your life, and in a matter of a week, you lose 40%. Because somebody was cutting costs, trying to do what exactly? You have the technology, you just wanting to lower the cost. But that's what I mean, that corruption is not only when a government official comes up and says, give me a little something. In fact, that's a smaller chunk. Think about the UN illicit capital outflows report that former President Mbeki was leading. It's only 30% of the money, the $60 billion or so a year that leave Africa, that are crime, human trafficking. The rest is base erosion and profit shifting, which means there's a lot of sophisticated machinery behind the scenes that will make it possible for private sector to get away with corruption. So I'm saying, let's admit corruption is bad, but let's agree that we're going to solve it collectively.
Yeah. You know, one of my big concerns is that whenever we see surveys like this, it's always a survey showing how corruption is growing in South Africa, how corruption is so rife on the continent. My fear is that corruption has almost become part and parcel of our culture.
Yeah.
And it's just become like, well, you know, if you want to get anywhere, you got to learn to play the game.
And
how do you rid a society that has been so tainted by corruption for so long?
Yeah, it starts with all of us. When we are in the pit, we are in the darkest of pits, we should imagine a brighter possibility. We came from dark apartheid because people imagined a better dispensation. We should understand that there's no way we can be equated to corruption. Let's accept it's not us. It doesn't define us. And remember, the silence of the majority is a bigger problem than the corruption of a minority. Let's agree that we're going to have to tackle it together, and let's accept that we are much better. We are worth a lot more than being a corrupt bunch.
Yeah. Do you think perhaps we're not strict enough on those that are found to be engaged in corrupt activities? For instance, I mean, you'll take somewhere like the UK. I mean, there are laws in place where, you know, if they are found to be involved in corruption of any kind, laws can lock them away in jail for in excess of 10 years. Do we have anything strong enough in the country?
Yeah, but they don't always lock them away, remember? I mean, you have a lot of scandals that have come to the fore, and people are still... In fact, Nigeria can claim to have much stronger law enforcement because the banking CEOs that were found to have been involved in the corruption that made the banking sector almost unworkable. Most of them are in jail. The former petroleum minister, who was said to have housed $700 million in her house, is now being hounded. She got arrested. And that's exactly what's going to happen. But I'm saying laws can only change so much. It's when we accept that those laws are necessary. In fact, we have many good laws, even in South Africa. But you're right. Unless we accept that is not our culture, it doesn't define us, and we dream of a better society where we do business fairly, we are doomed. The laws won't change a person's mind.
Yeah. Well, I love your way of thinking, Victor, and it's the only way that we can come right is to understand that corruption is what's killing us at the moment. Victor Kgomoeswana, thank you so much for joining us here on the program. The author of the book, Africa is Open for Business, again talking about another survey just proving how corrupt everything is getting. It says a report saying 55% of South African companies surveyed avoid certain countries because of the high risk of corruption. Thank you for joining us.
It's been a pleasure.
Take care, Victor. All right, let's get you another final weather